chose folk for a number of reasons. One, I mean, the real question is, who are Scottish folk? Who do we think they are, and who are they? And so part of this is a search for the nuances that exist in Scotland, as opposed to the sort of simple story of Scottish folk. On the flip side, you ask, why is folk important? Folk was one place that Scots could find a rich sense of identity, a rich sense of lore, of history.
To be honest, I think I was, like a lot of people, I didn't have a real solid grasp on what Scotland was really like.
You really don't read or hear much about it, so I didn't know what to think of Scottish culture.
Everyone who comes here has a different perception, I think, of what Scotland is or might be.
I think we get a lot of images of Scotland from popular culture, from movies, you know, whether it's Braveheart or Train Spotting and stuff like that.
Didn't change my perception. It taught me a lot.
I was sort of interested to see how the real Scotland matched up with the sort of pop culture representation of Scotland and Scottish history.
Pretty sky of blue, there's a light over you. Pretty sky of blue.
A lot of Scottish people seemed really interested sort of individually on defining what Scottish folk culture is.
Professional storyteller in Edinburgh, using the Scots language and its great richness.
Trying to discover what the identity is of what is Scotland.
People with really nationalistic sentiments, sort of the national poets and bards and prominent politicians who were very pro-Scotland. They seem to be the leaders in sort of promoting what is now exported as Scotland or Scotland folk culture.
I think they're very concerned with creating a Scottish identity and figuring out who they are, and that's what's most interesting about the whole thing. I loved Edinburgh. I absolutely loved Edinburgh. I thought that was one of the neatest towns I've ever been to, and even by European standards, I thought that was one of the greatest representations of a medieval town. You have the big, just towering castle looking out over the entire area from this big cliff up there. And, I mean, everywhere you go in the city, you can look up and just, that's your landmark. That's what you pinpoint. There's just this, the cliffs go up right to the walls. I mean, it's what a medieval castle needs to look like. It was just astounding. And then you walk through the streets and it's all the back alleys and the architecture with the houses just overhanging the streets. I mean, these cobblestone roads, narrow cobblestone alleys, just the atmosphere there was awesome. Just felt very, very medieval. I was excited about that. I loved Edinburgh. These little pubs just kind of tucked away everywhere you went. You get your warm stews and your hearty Scottish music.
Voice you used to love that you're gonna hate.
Sometimes you couldn't understand what our storyteller was saying.
The first job I had after I left the Skill was at Brotherson's the Bakers. Now that was just up the close.
Sweat and tears flow softly down the drain. They'll be back tonight in the same place. Amongst the maze of cubicles, you see the ebb and flow of
First time we were in Dundee, we saw a soccer game.
I loved the game. I loved the game so much.
Bulletins and answering machines just spew out syllables endlessly.
it's interesting, just try and keep an eye as you go around at what kinds of images are being presented to you that say Scotland on them.
I like the Isle of Skye. We stayed in sort of a small fishing village. The fishing industry is obviously a pretty big part of Scotland. So it was kind of nice to see how those communities sort of go about their everyday lives. Get to know some of the locals when we went and watched the rugby game.
In the morning, we went to the Fairy Glen.
Oh, the Fairy Glen. So we were on the island of Skye, and our guide, Ian, took us to this place called the Fairy Glen, which first of all is not a tourist destination. It's a place on the Isle of Skye, which is, there's no signs leading to it. You have to know, or be with someone who knows. Incredible natural landscape. The reason it's called a Fairy Glen is everything looks like it's on a different scale, because you have these hills with these paths cut into it, and there's some ponds there on the valley floors.
We walked up and everyone's falling over, and because it's wet, and but it was really magical, you know, and you're walking around, and we walked up on the top and had a beautiful view of everything, and it was interesting that nobody was living around there because of the superstition of the fairies.
There are all these traditional rock markings and some caves with bones hanging down and stuff like that from the old tradition of belief in fairies and some of the other folk culture aspects of the Isle of Skye.
We stopped and we got to see where Hogwarts Castle is superimposed, and where, you know, Dumbledore died on the island. We got to see the aqueduct where the train goes over in the movie. And then we got to go through the forest, which is in Glencoe, where they filmed, like where Hagrid's hut was, and then the Forbidden Forest.
Out of sort of the three sections of the travel, Edinburgh, the Highlands, and Glasgow, the Highlands were by far my favorite part of the travel.
This is where our version of folk, Scottish folk, comes from.
I think that for me is where a lot of the history of Scotland, especially the kind that people have chosen to sort of define Scottish culture, comes from. The stories and the tales and the songs have a lot to do with the Highlands.
We went and visited where Robert Burns wrote the poem, and we saw there was a statue where he had written. And then we sang the poem.
Bonnie lassie, will ye go? Will ye go? Will ye go? Bonnie lassie, will ye go? To the birks of Aberfeldy. Great. The little birdies blithely sing, while o'er their heads the hay goes.
I think that the Scottish Highlands was one of the most beautiful places I've ever been in the world.
Welcome to Scotland.